and a lot to our community. And like Leslie said, I mean, we've been waiting to listen to you and learn more about the history. A lot of us, although we might think we know the history, we probably don't. And making sure that we continue to listen to our history is important to us. And that's why through our Hispanic Heritage Month, we bring speakers like yourself to continue that. And so welcome to LA Harbor College. Welcome to the faculty, staff, and especially to our students that are joining us today. We are excited to have you, Dr. Pagan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, and then I just want to ask Carmen real quick. Carmen, are you here? Do you want to say anything?
Oh, well, I guess it's good afternoon now. I want to, first of all, thank you, Leslie, for thinking about presenting this very personal issue. Again, your grandfather and everything that it meant to you. And certainly, again, Dr. Pagan, for taking your time to present and give us more information. I also like to thank those of you who helped with planning Hispanic Heritage Month. It is certainly, again, an important time as we see what's going on in our world today, in our society today, things that are so local to us. We have to remind ourselves why we are here. We have to remind ourselves why we are in education and to be able to learn. And this particular issue today, in terms of looking at Sleepy Lagoon, and again, what is called the Zoot Suit Riot, is part of a history that many people do not understand or only know by stereotypes or bits and pieces. And I hope that today we get to see and hear and learn more about what it really means and what it is that we can learn from it. So again, thank you, Leslie, for presenting your perspective. And thank you, Dr. Pagan, again, for your perspective on this issue.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to share with you guys my PowerPoint. I made a PowerPoint just to highlight some things, and how I see this going is sharing the PowerPoint, but then me asking Professor Pagan about his research, about his book, The Murder at the Sleepy Lagoon. He spent 9 years researching this, and I really want to get his perspective on it. So the history of the Sleepy Lagoon, to me, when I was reading and learning about this and studying it, a lot of the things reminded me of just some common themes we're going through now, and parallels of criminalization and culture. And I was like, sad. I was sad. I was like, man, nothing's changed. And then also different things that I found out that I didn't know. So I'm a kinesiology major. I do not have, anything with history or sociology or anything like that. I didn't know. I studied the body and performance, but my grandfather was one of the 12. So he's there, he's Johnny in that picture towards the right. But Eduardo Obregon, he's the professional in this. So I'm so grateful that he was able to come and share with us today. So before also we begin, I just want to honor someone that I do believe fought for justice and equality for people, and that was RBG. And some of her quotes were, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." And then real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. And although we've made a lot of changes, there's still many more changes that need to be done, for sure. And then the last one I love, and she was talking about this with sex in terms of males and females, but I think it regards to anything, to anyone, right? All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off of our necks. And so I just want to honor her and her fight, and knowing that we all can speak up, and we all can fight, and we all can be part of the change. So before we get into Professor Pagan's insight, I just want to tell you a little bit about my grandfather, how we knew him. So my mom didn't know that he spent, time in jail until she was in her 20s. It's not something he talked about with us. In the top right is a picture of him when he was a little kid, like at a play. They were in a play. So my grandfather, when he was young, he had a lazy eye. He had a bad eye. So he could not ever join the service because of his, bad eye that he had. But he was a very, very, very hard worker. He was born in Arizona. He was an American citizen. Hard worker. His mother passed away when she had pneumonia. She was pregnant with the third child. She had pneumonia and she passed away when he was 2. So he grew up without, his mother in his life, but he was a hard worker, provided for his family. He went up to Alaska to work because he couldn't be in the Army, and because of his eyes, he wanted to be part of service. So he went up to Alaska, and he was working in Alaska with the U.S. Engineering Department. And then he came down because the war had started and he wanted to help out his family here. So he came down 2 weeks prior to the Sleepy Lagoon trial. So he just came out 2 weeks and was hanging out with his friends and when that happened. And then the one on the right is my grandmother, my grandma Mary, who is a very strong force in our life. They met a year after he got out of prison in San Quentin. And so this is how we knew him. Papa John. So my mom always called him Papa. So that was Papa. I'm gonna get emotional, but it's okay. And that was their anniversary. And my grandma was always a strong force, like I said, in our life. And that was their wedding day. That's my mom. She still looks like that. She's got the good genes. I hope she passes them on to me so I look young too. And then this is how we knew them. Grandpa, right? Grandpa John. So that was my grandma. My grandma passed away when she was 60 of cancer. My grandfather lived a long time past that. He had dementia and Alzheimer's in the later stages of his life. This was me in the middle, in the blue, and then my little sister, Deanna, she's here actually listening too. And that was Grandpa, our cousin Christy, and then this is our family at my sister Deanna's baptism at Olvera Street down there when we were younger. So that's how we knew Grandpa. And so we didn't know about all of the history that he was involved in. And so that's when I started doing my research. I wanted to present on this. I wanted to learn about it. And I found Dr. Eduardo Pagan's book and started, looking at it. I listened to a podcast he was on with Most Notorious, a true crime history. There's a lot of other podcasts I started listening to and just trying to take in all this information. And then listen to a video. And there's a lot of information that's the same, but there's some conflicting information out there too. So I'm, just not sure on that. But I want to first welcome Pagan, Professor Pagan. Is there anything you want to talk to us about why you chose to look at this book and this history?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for sharing those photographs. We were chatting right before we got started that it's interesting when you do research on historical figures, and I tried to gather as many photographs as I could of the boys and the girls that I was studying. And they were kind of college age youth. And so in my mind, there's still boys and girls right there, but they were young people. And but this gives me a little bit more perspective about his life before the event and also after. And I also, my grandfather, my abuelito was Juan. So he was also Papa John, in our family. So, why did I choose this topic? Well, I mean, as I think many of us know, the incident itself looms very large in Chicano history, or at least Chicano historical memory. And I was young when Luis Valdez's movie came out, which was based on the play. This is Zoot Suit. And I was always intrigued by this period, and I wanted to learn more when I was an undergraduate and read Mauricio Mason's work, Zoot Suit Riots. The late Mauricio Mason, he was a psychotherapist, and he used this kind of psychological analysis to try and understand what happened. But the more I read Rudy Acuña's work as well, Occupied America, the more questions I had about why. You'd mentioned contradictory information, right? And that's exactly what I encountered. I wanted to know more why. For example, we were just talking about Alice McGrath, for example, and one of the dominant interpretations that exist in Carrie McWilliams' work and Rudy Acuña's work and even Mauricio Mason's work was that all of this came about because of anti-Mexican hysteria. And if that were the case, and I don't doubt that, I want to be very clear about that. I mean, certainly we've all been subject to that, but if that was the sole explanation, where did people like Alice McGrath come from? Who worked tirelessly for years to get these boys acquitted. I mean, like, where does she come from? Or Carrie McWilliams, for example, where do they come from? You know, and even more to the point, why weren't they so saturated with this anti-Mexican hysteria that everyone else was? Like, what made these people special? So I just kept probing and asking questions. And then, you know, I like to know as much as I can about the people I study. I want to know what they, you know, what do they do when they get up in the morning? You know, where do they go for lunch? You know, it's that kind of stuff, right? So I just kept probing and probing and probing because I had these questions. And over time, as I mentioned a moment ago, for those who are just tuning in, it became patently clear to me that these kids, these young people were innocent. And not only were they innocent, but the justice system failed them terribly. And honestly, that was a source of outrage for me, even though this was in the past. I'm still angry by that. I really am. I can't explain why. I mean, it was a terrible injustice to all of them, both the young men and the young women. But what didn't exist in the literature, the historical literature, was anything that would actually show why they were innocent and how the justice system failed them. And that's really what I wanted to do. I was motivated by this outrage. To show not only was the evidence there that could have exonerated them, but their own defense team failed in their duty. And as well, the county DA's office, I believe, knew that they had evidence that would have exonerated these young people, but there was political pressure on them to get a conviction because there was concern at the time coming straight from the governor's office that law enforcement was incapable of handling what they called juvenile delinquency at this time. And they wanted to have this case to demonstrate that the police and the sheriffs were on top of it. And the district attorney's office was on top of it. In other words, they're trying to reassure the public that they could deal with any kind of internal dissent or any kind of juvenile delinquency, as they characterized it, during the war. And so these young people paid the price. When it was, as I said before, patently obvious to me that they were not there at the time of the murder. They were not responsible for the death of Jose Diaz. And so I wanted to be able to provide that information. So that's what kept me going, though, was this sense of injustice and wanting to right a wrong, at least as much as I could, right, with my research, to at least show people that they were innocent. And that's something. You know, you had mentioned earlier that your grandfather wanted to have a pardon. And one of the things that they lacked was that kind of official closure that they needed. Now, they couldn't receive a pardon because they were acquitted on retrial, and you have to have been convicted in order to receive a pardon. So technically speaking, but they never had that sense of closure, right? And even though I knew my book many had passed on by the time my book came out, I wanted to provide that closure at least, right? That here's the evidence that you were innocent and that you were abused, right, by the system. So that's what motivated me in just all those years of the research and the writing.
Thank you for all of that. I'm so grateful for you for doing that and serving your time on that purpose. Can you give us some context of what was going on in the 1940s?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I'll try and do this. You know, I always say this, that in order to understand this moment, this historical moment, we have to put our minds back in a time when racial segregation and racial privilege was everything. It defined everything. And you had laws not only defining as a racialized individual where you could go and couldn't go, and it went beyond just where you could live and not live, or where you had to sit on a bus, or even in the theater. It went far beyond that. It went into the realm of who you could socialize with, who you could marry, for example. But beyond the written laws, there were also unwritten laws, social expectations of people of color. And to kind of like characterize it in the way that I think we all understand is that if you were a racialized individual in the 1940s, and earlier and after, but since we're just focusing on this particular decade, right? If you were racialized, the norm was that you were required to defer to white privilege. And that ran the range from sitting at the back of the bus, for example, or sitting at the back of the theater. But even if you're walking down the streets of Los Angeles and there was a white couple walking towards you on the sidewalk, you're supposed to step off. You're supposed to be deferential. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. You weren't supposed to call attention to yourself in any way. This is their world, and you had to kind of acknowledge all the time, this is your world, right? These were the norms of segregation. And so if you understand that, then I think you can start to understand the power of what these young people were doing in resisting the norms of white privilege. And they resisted in all sorts of ways. And one of the things for folks who are tuning in that I hope you understand that for any social change to occur, there has to be pressure on all levels, not just the highest levels where the laws are made, but also on the street level. Everybody needs to be pushing in order to make that kind of change. And in my mind, these young people, they were pushing against segregation. And how were they doing it? They were doing it in who they socialized with. So the young people who lived in 38th Street, for example, or around 38th Street neighborhood in Los Angeles, they were a multicultural, multi-ethnic group. They weren't just all Chicano. And of course, they didn't call themselves Chicano back then, but they weren't all Mexican American. They were ethnic minorities from Europe, working class white, Bobby Thompson, in other words, these kids, they didn't hold up the norms of segregation that said, you need to stay in your corner and you need to stay in your corner. It's like, no, we want to hang out with who we want to hang out with. And so this was an integrated group, if you will. And that in itself was a defiance against the norms of white privilege and the expectations that existed. And then it went on from there. The clothing, for example, that was popular among young people at the time, which we typically call the Zoot Suit. Yeah, thank you for that. Let me just say this, and again, at the risk of sounding very particular, this is loyalty to the kids that lived back in that time. The kids in California, they never called it a Zoot Suit. It was either the drape or el tacuche, right? I mean, for them, if you went back in time, you said, hey, I like your Zoot Suit, they would have no idea what you're talking about. It was kind of an offense because el tacuche was their own version, right? It was a West Coast version of jazz culture. The Zoot Suit was something else on the East Coast, right? And so they never called it Zoot Suit. It was always the drape or el tacuche, right? But this fashion, though, and by the way, the one that with Edward James Olmos, that one, again, the West Coast fashion was different. That was based off of the East Coast African American style. The West Coast was more conservative, if you will. It wasn't quite as outlandish as this one here. And again, I don't mean to get really particular, but forgive me for just a moment. But in embracing this style, this jazz style and jazz culture, the thing about jazz was that jazz resisted white privilege as well. I mean, jazz was an art form, a musical form, a cultural form that really celebrated the soul of the individual. Whether they're on the dance floor or up on the stage performing, it didn't matter what color you were. What matters is what was in your soul and could you bring it out and share it with people. That was a vision that defied white privilege. White privilege said, you can't race mix, right? You can't dance on the dance floor with people who are not of your color. Can't do that. You can't perform on the stage with people who are not of your color. That's what segregation required. But the jazz world was different. The jazz world completely disregarded all of that. And so you had working class white kids, and you had African-American kids and Latino kids and Jews and ethnic immigrants from Europe as well, all mixing together in the jazz clubs. And that's an affront, again, to segregation. And as I was trying to put out in this book, was that also was resistance to racialized privilege. It was on the street level, but it was as valid as resistance that you would find at the higher levels. The middle-class Mexican Americans and African Americans, for example, were pushing for the right to vote. And even higher still, right? Resistance has to happen on all levels in order for change to occur, on the street all the way up to the very top, to the halls of legislature. So this is part of the context and the background. And let me just add one last thing, which would kind of put into context your grandfather's experience. So from a perspective of white privilege, when you see people defying the norms of social custom and the law, how would you describe them? They're lawbreakers. They're juvenile delinquents. They are upsetting society, right? They are challenging everything that is normal to us. And that was the language that was very common at this time, is they would describe young people who were doing nothing more than just enjoying life as themselves, hanging out who they wanted to hang out with, enjoying the music that they wanted to listen to. They were doing nothing more than that, but they were criminalized because it was a challenge. It was a symbolic challenge, but a very important challenge against racial privilege. And I promised that was the last thing, but I want to say one last thing as well on this topic. That vision that these young people had, that was the future, right? Segregation ended eventually. It starts with the Brown decision in 1954 and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But that vision that these young people had in the 1940s about what mattered was in your soul, and it didn't matter what your color was, and you could wear what you wanted to wear, and that assertion of their self and their identity in a public sphere that wanted to erase them, that was their way of saying, this is my land too. I belong here too, but you have to deal with me on my own terms, not your terms, my terms. As I said, that was the vision of the future. And this riot that broke out in 1943 was an effort to squash all of that down. But they carried the future, right? And so even though we're living in tough times now, the future's with us. There have always been efforts to stop social change. And they've failed in the end. It's been a rough ride. There's no question about it. There are difficulties that people encounter. But the future was with them and the future is with us as well. You know, we just need to get through this time, but not lose hope. So, sorry.
No, don't.
That was a bit long.
Sorry, I love that. I mean, when I was listening to that and hearing that myself, it reminded me of like hip hop or like rap or like with the youth, or even now, like a lot of youth are on social media, a lot of youth are marching, a lot of youth are like, to me is like, the youth is what sees the vision for the future and says, we're gonna change this.
Yes.
And so I think what you said is extremely important and powerful, and that's why I saw the connection. There was this video, and I'm not sure if you've seen it or what, I'm not gonna play it because it's 50 minutes of what's true or what's not true, but could you let us know, I'm gonna skip this, about the murder, like what happened that night in your research?
Sure,
These are my mom had newspaper articles from the day after, and media's role in what they're saying, boy wars, boy gangs, and things like that. Gangs were like, my grandfather, he never considered himself in a gang. It was his friends he hung around with from the neighborhood, that he hung around with for 2 weeks because he just moved back from Alaska. But can you talk about the murder, like what happened that night?
Sure. So again, keeping in mind this background that you've got segregation, that's the law, and it's being challenged by young people on the streets in all sorts of ways, right? And so there's this language that existed in Los Angeles about growing juvenile delinquency. And I argue that what they were criminalizing were simply young people who were referring to uphold racialized privilege. They were refusing to go along with that. Now that was seen as criminal from the perspective of people in power. There's no question about that. But I don't believe they were juvenile delinquents, just like your grandfather. He wasn't in a gang. He just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. But he was criminalized though, right? And he was criminalized by association. Now, back to the murder. So let me take you back to Los Angeles, back when it was rural. And I'll let you wrap your mind around that for just a moment. Los Angeles used to have lots of rural areas.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's just that I know you were talking about how like the youth, it's the future and they're making changes. So me and my family were having a discussion about that, about like Black Lives Matter, about brown people, and he told me that because I'm light skinned, I never experienced that, but I'm like, it doesn't matter because I may be light, but I still look Mexican. He could tell from my face that I'm just a light skinned Mexican. So my question to you is, back in the 40s, people that were light skinned but they were Hispanic, were they still treated the same? I told my brother we are. It doesn't matter if we're light because it's mostly more toward white power, but were light skinned Mexicans or Hispanics treated the same as like dark skinned ones?
Yes, yes, and that's a very good question. Thank you. And again, it's when we talk about race, it's not just about skin color. You can be racialized, for example, and be as fair as someone from Sweden. You know, we'll take the Irish for just a moment. And not to take this too far afield, but I just want to give you this quick example. The Irish in the United Kingdom have been racialized for 500 years. They still are to this day. And despite the fact that they are fair-skinned and light-eyed and light hair, you know, just think about like Bono, for example. You do U2 or, you know, the Corrs or any kind of, you know, popular Irish today. They look like other Americans. But in the United Kingdom, because they're Irish, because when they speak, you hear their ethnicity, they are denigrated and they are treated in every way as kind of the worst treatment that we have in the United States towards racialized minorities. And so when we're talking about race, it's more than just skin color. It can have a lot to do with how you speak, your accent, where you were born. And so, you know, so just keep that in mind. So yes, back in the 40s, but I would say the same thing as well. For you today, you can be racialized just by virtue of your place of birth or your community or your accent. Any number of those things can racialize you as the other. In other words, you're not us, right? You're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? Therefore, you're something else.
Yeah, that's what I told him. I'm like, because I told him like, yeah, I may look, I'm light skinned, but I sound Hispanic. I have an accent when I speak, so it doesn't matter. So I told him like I was saying, it just didn't matter about our skin tone. We should just get together and fight the common enemy, which is all the races and all these laws against us and minorities and stuff like that.
You make a very important point, and I want to make sure that that is not lost. Our strength is in our unity with people who have the same soul and vision that we have. It's not just in people who have the same color or the same ethnic background or national background. Our future, and again, this was the future that these young people had, you know, who love jazz. The future is together. All of us, we're working towards a better world. That's the future. And so making connections is the only way that we can advance. In fact, I would argue that, I was mentioning before Alice McGrath, look, your grandfather would not have been acquitted had it not been for her and Carrie McWilliams and all these other white people that didn't have to care, but they did. Not only did they care, they put their skin in the game. They put their labor and their time and their attention to getting these young people off that had no relationship to them. And just imagine what would have happened if they just said, yeah, they're not me, I don't care. Or, you know, if our community had said, you know what, you guys, thank you, but we have it, we've got it, right? Just do your own thing and we'll take care of it. What your grandfather was acquitted because people worked together and they brought together their different skills and their different resources to make change. And that is something that we need to remember today, right? Is that if we're going to get through this moment with any kind of sanity and with any kind of health, is that we work together with other people who are willing to work with us, independent of color, independent of politics, I would argue as well. You know, if you want an America and a future where we are together as a people, and it's okay to be you, right? It's okay to have your accent. It's okay to have your color. We need to work with, you know, make connections with all kinds of people. That's the only way that this is really going to change. But I'm hopeful. Again, I'm still hopeful as a historian, having seen things in the past, that we will get through this and that the future is with us. In fact, I can't think of a historic example in American history now where this kind of conservative effort to stop change succeeded. They might succeed in the short run, but they fail in the long run. All right, now back to this question about what happened on the night. August 1st, 1942, rural Los Angeles County. It's kind of where Bell is today. There was this large farm that existed. It was called the Williams Ranch. And they grew corn and all kinds of things out there. And on this ranch, like many places today, it was populated. The workers on the ranch were largely Mexicanos, but there were Japanese as well, some ethnic minority whites living on the ranch, working as the ranch hands. And on the day of August 2nd, it was actually the night of August 7th, one of the families, the Coronado family, they had a daughter who was turning 21. And they were going to have a celebration, Mexicano style, right? So everybody's invited, food's on the table, have a little orchestra playing music, and everyone's just getting together, having a good time. That's what was happening on this Williams Ranch. And on this ranch was this reservoir that they used the water to water the fields. And the local kids called it the Sleepy Lagoon because that's where they would go to swim. And that's where they to go to make out as well. I mean, it was kind of like a known little local spot in rural Los Angeles. So this party's going on August 2nd. And about 10 o'clock at night, there were some local boys from Downey who crashed the party. Now, the kids from Downey who crashed the party, they were predominantly Russian immigrants. But they had been in Los Angeles long enough to kind of know our slang. Right? And so they knew how to insult people at the party, if you know what I'm saying. And so they crashed the party because they heard there's beer, and they got thrown out by all of the party goers. They kicked them out of this party, 10 o'clock at night. Well, when they left, part of the thing was, we'll get you. We'll be back. We'll get you. So as they're leaving the party and they're driving by the reservoir, parked along the reservoir were some of the kids of the 38th Street neighborhood. Henry Levis, for example, and his girlfriend. And let's see, I'm drawing a blank on some of the other names right now, but just a few of the kids. They're hanging out. They're walking around the reservoir, they're necking or things like that. Well, these kids from Downey come driving by, and they start harassing the kids who are in the parked cars. And Henry Levis was the kind of guy that you're not going to push Henry around. So Henry sticks his head out and says, you think you're man enough, you come do something with it. There's a little fight that broke out. And then these kids from Downey, they leave. Well, what happens then was that the kids that were in the parked cars, they were roughed up pretty bad. I mean, there were some beer bottles thrown and black eyes and things of that nature. Well, they kind of collect themselves and they go back to their neighborhood in 38th Street, and they get everyone who's around and say, you know what, we've been roughed up by the Downey boys. We need your help. And so there are a number of other young people who are at 38th Street that said, sure, yeah, of course, we'll help you out. So they all get in their cars, cram in their cars, they drive back to the Williams Ranch, and they're looking for the Downey boys. Well, the Downey boys are long gone. But by the time that they get back, this is now about 1 o'clock in the morning. And so they're all kind of like around this reservoir. They're kind of looking for the Downey boys, can't find them anywhere. But they hear the sound of a party going on, off in the distance. And one of the kids says, well, let's look over there. And maybe we can find the Downey boys over there. So they all hop in their cars and they drive over to the party. When they get to the party, of course, the Downey boys aren't there. But all the party goers, they're, again, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. The party's going full swing. One thing leads to another, and I think it was a case of, I don't know, sometimes people, they get themselves worked up, and it doesn't take much to start swinging fists sometimes. And there's a fight that breaks out between the kids at 38th Street and the partygoers. The fight lasts for maybe 5 minutes. Somebody says, here comes the cops. And so all the kids in 38th Street, they jump in their cars and they take off. Well, all the partygoers who are there at the ranch, they're kind of picking themselves up and dusting themselves off, and they're trying to figure out, okay, who's hurt, who needs attention, and they're looking around. Everyone's looking around, and they find this young person lying on the dirt road, face down, and it was Jose Diaz, and he'd been beat pretty badly, and they called the ambulance, and he's taken out to LA General Hospital, and he dies about 4 o'clock in the morning. And he was mortally wounded at that point. He was beat pretty bad about the head and about the body as well. Well, the sheriff's department, they start doing dragnets to try and figure out who killed Jose Diaz. And they pull in about 600 kids. Anyone who's on the street, they pull them in, beat them for confessions. And I mean, literally beat them for confession. You know, so I had records of Henry Lavis, for example. His attorney walked in, and he was then transferred to the LAPD. And his attorney walked in where he was handcuffed with his hands behind the chair, and his nose was dripping blood because the policemen were just beating him a confession out of him. And that's the way law enforcement was back then. They just had the suspicion automatically, you're not going to tell the truth, so they're going to beat it out of you, right? That was normal back then. Well, eventually they focus in on the kids of 38th Street as the ones who killed Jose Diaz. And that's how the whole thing goes on from there. I try and show in my book that Jose was actually mugged before he left, before the 38th Street kids arrived. And I go through the forensic evidence because I found the autopsy report as well. And I kind of reconstruct what went down that caused him to be mortally wounded. And then I reconstruct this timeline to show that he was already lying on the ground before the kids of 38th Street arrived. So they could not have been the ones that hurt him. He was actually the victim of a mugging. And the reason why he was mugged, let me just say this very quickly, was that he had signed up to go into the Army. And so this is a Saturday night. He's leaving Monday. And what happened was a lot of the party goers, you know, they would give him beers, and they gave him money as well. He'd also been paid that day. And so 1 o'clock, about midnight, when he left the party, and again, I have evidence of people who saw him leaving the party, he was pretty drunk, and he had money in his pocket, and he just made an inviting target for somebody. And as a matter of fact, I have the names of the 2 young men that were seen with him leaving the party, and they were never questioned by the police, ever. And that's one of the examples of malfeasance that I try and illustrate, is that, you know, when it comes to investigations, you always start with the last people seen with the deceased to try and establish your timeline. They never asked them. The police, the sheriff, they never asked these 2 guys, you know, where were you when Jose Diaz, you know, was brutally beaten? You know, what can you tell us about what you know? They were never asked. So anyway, so the court proceeds, the court case, you know, and this is a picture of 21 of them, if I remember correctly. They're all charged with the murder of Jose Diaz. And this is like a mass trial. Now, each of them have their own attorneys. This woman in the hat right in front of you with the kind of the white polka dot dress and the hat, she was one of the attorneys. And, you know, these kids, they were pretty much laborers. They didn't have money. And so this was back before public defenders were a part of the American jurisprudence. So a lot of these families, they scraped their money together and they hired whatever attorney they could hire. Didn't matter whether they're qualified, didn't matter if they knew what they're doing. They hired whoever they could hire. And most of these attorneys were not worth a dime, in my view. Because as I mentioned earlier, it was clear to me that nobody either looked at the autopsy or constructed a timeline just to figure out who was where at what point. Because had they done that, they would have known that these young people were not at the party at the time that Jose Diaz was beaten. They would have known that the LAPD and the sheriff's office never questioned the 2 young men that were seen leaving the party in the company of a very drunk Jose Diaz. None of them caught that, ever. And so part of the way the justice system failed them was that their defense attorneys were largely inadequate. There was one who was really quite good, but most of the others failed them. They failed their clients. So I probably went on a little bit long, so I apologize.
No, that was perfect. But can you talk about like how they treated them like they couldn't shower. They all were sitting together. They couldn't sit with their defense attorney. The judge, I was reading that the judge would help the prosecution and
Yeah.
like talk to them. And then their expert witness, I put the quote down there. He went on, he was within the sheriff's office, and he said Mexicans as a community are related to Indians and Orientals, and it's part of their culture to be violent. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this was, again, I mean, you have to like put yourselves back in the time where racialized privilege is the law. It is social custom. It is normal. People are saying overtly racist stuff all the time. So one of the star witnesses you were just mentioning for the prosecution was, gosh, I think he was a media specialist, if I remember correctly, for the sheriff's department. He was just called as an expert witness. And the argument that he was trying to make, because you have to remember now, this is during World War II. We're locked in a battle to the death with Imperial Japan, and there's a lot of racist, anti-Japanese stuff going on, right? And what this guy was trying to do on the witness stand was trying to say, look, we know that these people are criminal because of their murderous ancestry. Look at the Aztecs and the human sacrifices they did. And we know that the native people of Americas are Oriental in origin. And look at what's going on in Japan, right? And so he was trying to like tie all these racist ideas together to basically say, you have to cage these wild animals. In fact, he uses that, right? I mean, he says you can't have, I think he compares them to a wild cat, like a lion or a tiger. You can't have them roaming free in society because they'll hurt you. So you've got to put them in a cage. That's the only alternative. And so he's using this real racist argument to say these guys deserve to be locked up. Doesn't matter. You know, he didn't say it doesn't matter, but the implication was it didn't matter whether there was no eyewitness that could ever put these young people at the scene of the crime with Jose Diaz still alive. There was no murder or no witness that could do that. They had no murder weapon. They had no motive, right? The state could provide none of that. But the evidence that they did have were things like expert testimony. They said, look, we know these guys are up to no good because look at who they are. Look at where they come from. Look at their history, right? And that was all part of the state's argument. So the fact this is a mass trial, this picture up to your upper left, there was no way that they could all sit around the defense table. And so what the judge did is he just set up a bunch of chairs over to one side of the room, opposite of the jury. So just the dynamics of that alone was loaded, but just opposite of the jury. So these 21 kids are all sitting opposite of the jury. They couldn't talk to their attorneys at all during the trial. They couldn't get up and talk to them, or the attorneys couldn't get up and talk to them because it was disruptive of the trial. So that by the very setup, they were denied access to representation. In fact, that was the legal clause that got this whole case thrown out on retrial, was that setup right there. But, you know, I would, as I said before, even if they were allowed to sit next to their attorneys, gosh, I think there were 7 attorneys. As I said, maybe one definitely was good and knew what he was doing. All the rest, even if they had access to their attorneys were just not qualified. And so as I said, that's one of the ways in which the justice system failed them. But there were a number of them that were convicted and sent to San Quentin, not all of them. But a number of them were sent to San Quentin for life, for murder. Again, I want to emphasize, there was never an eyewitness produced that said, yes, I saw John Matuz hit Jose Diaz. Never. Nobody. Not even hinted at, right? So no eyewitness. The state never produced a murder weapon. The state never produced motive. Like, why would they do this? Other than the fact that they're dangerous people, right? That was about the only motive they could produce. So despite the weaknesses of the case, the jury convicted. And, you know, my book goes into more detail about why they convicted. And, you know, some of these young kids, they undermined their own case, sadly. But, you know, they're young kids. They would tease each other during the trial. They would make fun of, you know, one of their attorneys actually had a kind of a twitch, right? And they would make fun of him behind their back. And the jury's just watching them the whole time and giving them the evil eyes. Like, these kids are acting like delinquents. Of course they must be guilty, right? I mean, it all just kind of played in a very bad way for the eventual outcome of this trial. So.
Someone asked too, and I did put it on this one. So these were
Yeah,
the 12. that had first degree and 2 counts, life in prison, second degree, 2 counts, 5 years to life. And I have the transcripts from a lot of it. And like you said, they were asking, but there was no proof. And I know, like, I read and they were telling about them, you know, and like my grandpa, he had $98 in his pocket because he just got back from Alaska. He's a worker, and they beat him because they're like, yeah, right, that's not your money. Like, where'd you get that from? He beat him till they passed out.
Yes.
You know, but there was also young women that were there, and someone mentioned it in the chat. Can you talk about what happened to the women? The only ones I could find was Lorena Encinas and Dora Baca and 3 others. I couldn't find the other names because I wanted to give them, you know, mention, but I know that they were sent to the Ventura Reform School, which I heard was really, really, you didn't want to go there. So
Yeah.
can you talk about that?
You know, sure. Yeah. Thank you. You know, and the reputation of Ventura, I mean, it varied depending on who you talk to. Look, no one wants to go there. I mean, you know, given the choice, who would want to go there? Whether it had a bad reputation or not, seriously. I mean, who would want to go there? So, yeah, back to this. So back to this moment at the Williams Ranch, when the 30th kids drove up to the party. They're boys and girls together, boyfriends, girlfriends, people just hanging out. It wasn't just all male. And some of the girls were involved in the fight that broke out at the Williams Ranch as well. Pretty handily, I might add, by some of the discussions. In fact, I apologize, I'm drawing a blank on the person that I spoke with. And again, I want to say it was Mora, but I don't think it was, but he told me years later, it's like some of his friends, his female friends, are like, you did not want to mess with them in a fight. So they could handle themselves very well. So despite the fact that both male and female were involved in this fight, given the gendered constructions of the day, and this is what I argue in the book, the prosecution came down harder on the young men than they did on the young women. Young women they're not violent, you know, they're nice, they're fairer sex, you know, it's all of that. And I think that protected many of them from the charge of murder. Or they were convicted on the charge of riot, but they were never tried for fighting, battery, for example, assault, certainly not charged for the murder, even though they were there and just as involved as their boyfriends or the other male friends in the group. So I argue it was really the kind of gender paternalism that existed in that period that actually protected them from getting the same charge that these young boys received. So did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. And
Okay.
then, you know, this was them in San Quentin.
Yeah.
My grandfather is John Matuz. So
Yeah.
they were there. And then
Yeah.
can you talk about what happened with the riots after that?
Yeah, so they're convicted in January of 1943. The riot breaks out in 1943. So about 5 months later, the riot breaks out. Now, in a direct way, this riot was not the result of the trial. So for those of you who remember the Rodney King verdict, for example, there was a verdict that came out, and then there was a riot in Los Angeles afterwards, and there was a very direct connection between that. This didn't have that same dynamic, but it was connected by the context of the times. So again, you remember the racial ideologies that existed, particularly for Mexican Americans, or heaven forbid that they would actually be of any kind of Asian descent, so Japanese American, Filipinos, Chinese American. So there's this very clear, overt racist views about who they are and what motivates them, right? So getting back to what I said before about segregation and the role that jazz culture played, and I think you're absolutely right. I love the example of hip hop. It's the same thing, that hip hop is an art form, it's a musical form, it's a cultural form, a stylistic form that cuts across the color line, right? And jazz was the same way back in World War II. But as I said before, this clothing, this article clothing, 2 things about it. One, it was outlandish for the context of the day. And given the norms of segregation that said that if you're a racialized individual, you had to stay in the background and don't call attention to yourself. This clothing was a way of their saying, deal with me on my own terms. You can't ignore me, right? but you have to see me as I am. So it was an affront right away to the norms of segregation. On top of that, the suit was actually empowering. And there were a lot of reports by young people. I had probably found about 80 police reports that people would call in with complaints about these young people not deferring to whiteness. And they characterize it in terms of criminalization, like, oh, they pushed me off the street. But again, you have to understand the context of segregation. For a racialized young person to be aggressive towards a white person in public, that was huge, right? That was huge, and people criminalized that. So when they wore this fashion, it was empowering to them. It was a way of like saying, I am here, this is me, right? And the last thing I'll say about it is that the fashion was androgynous. So women also wore the fashion, not to the same number as young men, but you did have women wearing it. And there was lots of negative commentary about kind of the femaleness or the feminineness of this particular fashion even when the young men wore it. So you have some gender bending that's going on. And again, within the context of World War II, I mean, people are just losing their minds, right? That these kids are so deviant and unapologetic about their deviance. So the riot breaks out. And the curious thing about this particular riot is that I never found any murders, any rapes, any serious assault I mean, serious in the sense that people wound up in the hospital, that resulted of this riot.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
Sorry.
Could you please repeat what you said?
I happened to trigger Siri, so something I said there. Anyway, but what the rioters did is that they attacked anyone they found wearing this fashion and made them strip it off. And if they didn't strip it off, then they got beaten until they were disabled, and then they stripped off the clothing. And that's the picture you see of these two young people on the street, is they were beaten. And you can barely make this out, but if you notice the pant leg of this young man who's laying on his back, it's ripped open. And this is what the rioters would do, is they would destroy the clothing and they would burn it, right, in front of these young people. And so I argue in my book is within the context of white supremacy of this day, this was a way of people pushing them back in their place, pushing them back in their corner, taking their symbols of defiance and destroying them as a way of saying, this is what I can do to you. And this is where you belong, right? Down on your knees, on the ground. So it was an assertion of white privilege and trying to shore up the walls of segregation that these young people are pushing against all the time. So that's how I read this riot. The riot went on for about 5 days. And it ended when the military finally ended leave for the military personnel. In other words, they were restricted to the base. They couldn't go out. And that's when the riot effectively ended in Los Angeles.
I heard that, and then I heard that they like officially banned the zoot suit. Is that right? Like they said, like you couldn't wear it. It was.
So there was an effort in San Diego, not in Los Angeles, but there was an effort by a city councilman to try and get the zoot suit banned because it provoked violence. It didn't go anywhere, but the fact that someone thought that, oh, this is how we're going to promote public safety, is to ban, this article of clothing, kind of shows you how outlandish some people were even back then. There are crazies in every generation. I'll just say that, right?
Yeah. And then you want to go back to the trial. You mentioned Alice McGrath, who was a secretary, Carrie McWilliams, a national chairman. I love what you said about it's about all of us coming together. It's about people with the same purpose, people with the same soul to create. And Alice was in her 20s.
Yeah.
She was young. Yeah. She was fighting for them. So can you you kind of spoke on it, but celebrities came into play. Rita Hayworth.
Yeah. So let me tell you about Alice. So Alice, at the time, she had her first child. If I recall, he was still in a stroller. So, he was just a few months old. And she was hired just to take notes for one of the attorneys. That was it. And so she would go to the trial and she'd sit in, back where the audience was, and she'd take notes. And in the process of just watching the dynamics and taking notes, she became outraged. She saw what was going on. And that's when she became like electrified. And that's when she kind of came forward and found other activists and said, count me in. What can I do to help? You know, this is an injustice. So she was a remarkable individual. I mean, how many people do you know that would just step forward and say, you know what, this is wrong, and I am going to do something about it? That was Alice, right? So she, as I mentioned, she devoted countless hours, unpaid, not just, you know, making flyers and talking to people and fundraisers, but she would get on the train and travel for a couple hours to get up to San Quentin. She's down in LA, and these young people are up in San Quentin. It's probably a 3-hour train ride once a month, just to visit them, trying to keep their spirits up, just to, you know, just because that's the person Alice was. She was a remarkable individual, as well as Carrie McWilliams and a lot of the others that came together. And Kerry was the kind of guy that realized, so Kerry was pretty well placed in California politics. And he realized that if this thing was going to succeed, we need to get Republicans and Democrats, people on the left, people on the right. We need to get as many people as we can to support this effort. And so Kerry was very smart in not making this either a Republican issue or a Democratic issue or a left issue or right-wing issue. He welcomed support from anywhere. And I think that was truly the political genius of Kerry McWilliams in this effort, was that, again, it takes all of us, you know, to use a phrase, it takes a village, right?
Yeah, and then they did. It got overturned in October of 44.
Yeah.
Because of the misconduct by the trial judge, denial of the legal rights, everything you mentioned.
Yeah.
And they went forward for that. And then I want to talk about what happened like afterwards and what your view is on that. You know, like you said, some of them, because they were in jail, they got addicted to heroin or something. I know our grandfather smoked a lot and, you know, drank a lot of alcohol. He did get sober, but I think it was, you know, after a while it did cause the dementia and Alzheimer's. And, you know, he was very, like we said, he never talked to us about it. He was very quiet. He held it all in. He was a strong man. He was a hard worker. Like, he supported his family for 30 years. He worked at Safeway, but he could never get a raise or a promotion because that they told him, you're the wrong color.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't get that. But there was some people that fought for them afterwards. So what did you see for after this, like life after? What happened?
So this was, I mean, this is part of what I wanted to do for these young people I mentioned before, that they never had official closure. I mean, they were out of prison. They were happy about that. They were back to their normal lives. But some of them picked up habits in prison that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. You know, Henry Lavis, for example, who was the so-called ringleader of the 38th Street kids, and he wasn't. A lot of other kids of 38th Street said, no, Henry wasn't. He wasn't, you know, a gang boss. But, you know, Henry got strung out on heroin and wound up taking his life in a botched robbery, 1972, if I remember the year correctly. And my point is, though, it's not to dwell on their challenges, but to ponder how their life would have been different had they not been put through this blender of public shaming and abuse by the law. How would their lives turn out differently? They, even though they were acquitted, they paid for this for the rest of their lives. They did. And that was part of, again, what I was, in my own way, what I was hoping to be able to provide was just to, you know, the evidence that here's what shows you were not guilty. And here's what shows, you know, that you were abused by the system. And so my book really tries to kind of like walk through in fine detail everything that happened that night, but also the ways in which the legal system abused them and cheated them. And it was really because of this. I mean, it's just recognition that afterwards, you know, some of them did get clean, and some of them went on to have you know, fairly normal lives within the confines of a racialized country. But there were a number of them that just, as I said, they just wound up paying for it for the rest of their lives. And so that's part of what fueled my righteous indignity over this.
Yeah, and you know, they didn't teach my mom and their kids Spanish because they didn't want them to have the same you know, prejudice towards them. And I don't know Spanish. I took it in school, but I didn't grow up with it. And I think that our culture is extremely important and we need to celebrate it. and we need to all come together and celebrate each other's cultures. But so if you could take anything from this, from what you learned, what would you tell the young people today, or even our society today? How could we, go forward? How can we go forward from everything that you've learned from those 40s, and as we continue to go forward to the state we're at right now? What can we do?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me say, first of all, to your point about not knowing Spanish, I would say this: look, you're not alone. There are many Latinos who grew up in the United States where their parents made a strategic choice to enforce English, and they did it because of the prejudice and harassment that they faced. And so, in an effort to protect you, they chose to make sure that you were fluent in English as a way of getting ahead, right? And being able to have the life that they wanted to have. And so, I honor that sacrifice that they made for us. And I just want to say that if that's your situation, don't be ashamed that you don't know Spanish. You can pick it up. That's not a problem. I was born speaking Spanish. I mean, English is my second language, but I'm not as fluent as my grandparents were. But that's part of our experience, right? That's part of the Chicano experience, and it is who we are, and it's fine. It's okay. And we can always learn. So don't worry about that. Don't let that hold you back. Don't feel ashamed. You don't need to feel ashamed before you are. And particularly, as I said, the choices your parents and grandparents made to try and keep you safe, given their circumstance and their experience, right? But I love the fact that you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg's picture up here. And again, just to go back to what I said before, is that it's going to take all of us to push change and to help this country realize the fullness of its promise, right? That we are all equal. It will take all of us. And so one of my takeaways from this is in my own work, my own strategizing, my own community work as well, I've been much more mindful of finding other people of good heart and good soul who are willing to fight the good fight and to bring them into the family, if you know what I'm saying, right? Rather than just looking at people that look like me. If we do that, we will lose. If we open our hearts, in fact, I would just say this. This is our heritage as Mexicanos, as Chicanos, as Latinos. We are a mixed race people. I have relatives that are Black, that are blonde, that are brown like me. This is my heritage. This is my family. And so politically, I do the same thing in terms of making connections. And it's okay, right? It's okay that as Latinos, as Hispanic surname individuals, we have people across the color line. That's our heritage. I'd like to tell people, we're the all of the above category, right? We have Africans in the Caribbean, we have Africans in Mexico, we have, of course, Indian, American Indian, Mexican Indian as well. We have European, French, Spanish, Germans even in Mexico, right? That's all us, right? That's all of us. So I guess my takeaway is just to have a more expansive view of who we are. And the potential of embracing that expansive view, working together to making a more just society. So that's my takeaway.
Man, you're amazing. I just want to say I'm so grateful for you coming today. And our time is up, but I just want to, do you have any time if anyone has a question or two to
Sure.
answer?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
I'll open it up if anybody has a question for Professor Pagan. Yes, I love this. This is amazing. I'm so grateful for you. I'm gonna cry. I'm so grateful. This is powerful. But does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? No questions, everyone's shy. Someone asked, where's the best place to buy your book?
Oh, that's a good question. I think if you go on
Amazon?
Amazon will carry it.
Any other place besides Amazon?
It's the most convenient place. I can't think of any, it's from the University of North Carolina Press. So if you went to their website, you'd be able to find it there. But yeah, you might be able to order it through Barnes and Noble as well. You know, some of the major distributors like that.
Yeah, I think when I Googled it for the picture, there was a lot of different places that you could purchase it.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's,
Leslie,
yes.
I have a comment to make. I think the talk was very, very educational. I learned quite a bit. I didn't know, I never heard of this. I was born and raised in Costa Rica, so I don't know very much history about Los Angeles, which I find it just fascinating. And I just want to mention that this ties in with the talk that we had on Wednesday with the salsa history. And I think it ties very well with the talk that we're going to have next Friday, which is how the census data has shaped and is shaping the demographics and the politics. And I want to invite everybody to it. And Dr. Pagan, if you could attend, I think you will find it fascinating as well, because the message from that talk also is, let's make sure that our voices are heard, and you know, let's not stay quiet, and let's do everything possible to make sure that we are heard. And I think you will enjoy very much that talk as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, let me make this offer. If anyone wants to communicate afterwards, I'm happy to respond by email. If you think of something you'd like to chat about or have a question, feel free to write me afterwards. And so I just extend that invitation to everybody.
Someone did ask, how accurate did you find Luis Valdez's play Zoot Suit? I know, like, for us personally, I know our grandfather, they weren't a fan of it. He didn't feel like it would portray it. And my grandfather too, like him and they never wore Zoot Suits personally.
Right.
Like he
Yes.
never.
Yes, exactly. They did not. In fact, what's interesting was that, you know, to my knowledge, tell me this. In fact, this is what I heard, but answer this because I get to ask you directly. Did your grandfather speak Spanish?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I heard, I think it might have been Alice who told me that none of them spoke Spanish. And so I got that line.
They spoke mostly English because they didn't want to, but they knew how to speak Spanish.
Yeah. So again, the question was, if you remind me.
Oh, the Zoot Suit movie, how accurate?
Oh yeah, how accurate it is. So let me be diplomatic. Luis is an artist and a dramatist, and dramatists in creating their productions paint with very broad brushstrokes so that the message is very, very clear. And in the space of what, maybe an hour or longer for the movie, you know, they've got to tell this very complicated story, whereas I had 400 pages to really go into detail, right? And so I can't fault Luis for kind of glossing over a lot of things and simplifying a fairly complicated story. Is it accurate? I think in the most general way, yes. When it came to personalities, not so much. And as you pointed out, they didn't all wear zoot suits. In fact, most of them didn't. I mean, it was an expensive item of clothing, the drape, right? I estimated probably cost them about 2 months' wages to make one of those. You couldn't go to the store and just buy them. You had to have them made. That's why they were so expensive. And so most young people didn't actually have it. It was an expensive item of clothing. So, you know, that was inaccurate. There was no one like Ed Pachuco, right? Edward James Olmos's famous character. There's none of them talked that way or acted that way. In fact, I know where he got that characterization, and he was an actor who was trying to convey through his stylization of this narrator, he was trying to convey something. But if you went back in time and saw someone walking around going, orale, you know, and all this kind of stuff that he does in the movie, like people were like, they go like, who are you, right? What? You know, so no, they didn't they didn't act like the character of Ed Pachuco. That's not what they did. They didn't speak Calo as well. Again, these are just working class kids. You know, they didn't have this arcane underground lingo that they spoke to each other. They spoke English. You know, so that's one of the ways in which it was different. And Luis, you know, he's fascinated with this notion of Calo and Pachuquismo and all these kinds of things. And he's used them in other portrayals. If you notice, for example, La Bamba, the movie, the older brother is basically a Pachuco, right? You know, so he's always fascinated with this kind of like this outlaw character, right? These, again, back to your grandfather, he was a good kid. He was a hard worker, and he happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all it was. He's the kind of kid, most of them were, that you'd be happy to call your friend, right? They weren't anything like, you know, Ed Pachuco, for example.
Yeah. Somebody asked, do you know if the officers or the people involved, if they were ever apologized or ever felt bad for what happened, or were they just part of?
Not to my knowledge. And here's where things get really interesting, is that some of the arresting officers in the sheriff's department were Spanish surnamed, Spanish speaking. Now, it doesn't mean that they were necessarily Mexicano, but you know, some of the ones that beat up Henry, they were, you know. So to my knowledge, there was never an apology, but I do know Alice did say that when they were in San Quentin, the warden, Warden Duffy, said to her, "These kids don't belong here." You know, they were in San Quentin with hardened criminals, murderers, rapists, arsonists, and as I said, they were like your grandfather. They were just hardworking kids that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, so that's probably the closest that I could find that anyone on any official level just basically said, "This isn't right." You know, it was the warden who knew hardened personalities, and he could look at these young people and just say, "Nah, they don't belong here."
I was reading in one of the transcripts, and so it was, they're talking about our grandfather, and they said the same thing, like he didn't have any priors or anything, but one time he went to jail looking for his cousin, or he went, and then they kept him for questioning, and like when he just went to look for like a family member, and they told him, "You don't belong with these people, you know, leave or get out," and so they did. But
Yeah.
Similar to what you said.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other questions before we conclude? I put Professor's email in the chat.
I have a comment.
Yes.
Gracias, Professor. It was amazing. And basically my comment is that a lot hasn't really changed since then regarding racial profiling. And I obviously speak Spanish fluently and I love it. But when I am at a store and there's like other races around, they do give me a look as of why I am speaking another language that is not English. So I kind of feel that a lot hasn't changed since then. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you for that opinion. I wouldn't disagree with you, but I do want to point out this. We are here in the sense that all of us here have opportunities that were denied our grandparents. They would have loved to have gotten an education. They would have loved to have had the opportunities that we're enjoying now. And the fact that we're here gives us some power and it gives us some leverage, right? So yes, we still have a lot of work to do. I absolutely agree with you, but we are in a greater position of power and leverage than our grandparents were. But we got here because of them, right? Because of the work they did to get us here, to break down the walls of segregation and to make changes so that their children and grandchildren could have a better life. And we're the beneficiaries. And so we owe, again, the people who are not here, and we owe the work and the sacrifice of our ancestors to keep pushing on the fight and to not give up.
Thank you.
I love that. It's so true. We are here because of their sacrifices.
Yes.
We're here because of their sacrifices. I know someone just had a minor question on the detail of and I think you answered it, and I think this is what I heard, but they're asking about if Jose Diaz was mugged before they even got there, how did they not notice? But if there's no fight and there's chaos and someone's on the ground, sometimes you just don't see that. Or what was your take on that?
So, all right. So remember that he wasn't discovered. Well, okay, I shouldn't say you remember. I wouldn't expect you to know these details. So he wasn't discovered until 1 o'clock in the morning. And he was about 60 yards away from where the party was. And it was dark. It wasn't lit at all. And it wasn't until the people of the Coronado family and the other party goers started kind of like looking around to make sure that they found everyone who was hurt. That's when they found him. But he was off kind of in a ditch in the dark. That's why no one had seen him prior to that moment, right? They had no reason to go looking for him because the last they saw, he left. He was on his feet. He was staggering, but he was on his feet, and that's all they knew. And then when they saw him next, about an hour later, he's mortally wounded at that point. So that's why he wasn't found. It was dark and it was unlit.
Yeah, and so I just want to conclude with saying thank you so much for reminding us about the power of our history and how much they did sacrifice for us. I mean, emotional again. and our opportunities that we have now. And I believe to honor that, to honor their struggle, is to keep going forward for our next generations and the generations. Like, I know if you guys saw, my daughter was like creeping in here, but it's for them, for our kids, and then for their kids, right, to continue. So is there any final thoughts that you want to share with the group as we conclude?
Well, I just want to say this, and I don't mean to romanticize the struggle at all. It's hard. It is hard. And I just want to acknowledge the difficulty that we're all going through. But we have each other. And we have resources now that our parents didn't have and our grandparents didn't have. So I'm encouraged, as I said before, the history is with us, and the future is going to be with us. It's going to be a little bit difficult to get there, but I'm confident we will get there. As I said before, I can think of no moment in American history where the conservative forces of society managed to stop change from happening. And that's what's happening right now, is that people are pushing against change. And the change is that there's more of us. And there are more people who are joining us. More intermarriage, right? They're all part of our large family now. That didn't used to be. And people are reacting to those changes. But we have the future. It's with us. So hold strong, and we'll do this together.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your Friday with us. Thank you for responding to my email. Say thank you. and thank you for your work that you've done. A lot of people in the chat are saying thank you, awesome event, thank you. They appreciate you and grateful. So again, I really do appreciate you. And
thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for tuning in and for listening to me. Stay strong and stay hopeful, and we will do this. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you. You need
Good
extra
job,
credit
Leslie.
in the chat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing such an awesome event. Can't wait to see this on YouTube. If you guys could please share the link, that would be awesome.
I will. I'll send it out.
Thank you.
Oh, don't talk. I'm on mute.
Good job, Leslie.
Thank you.
What do I do?
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dorado.
Thank you, Leslie.